So, Sayeeda, thank you very much for joining us. I suppose my first question is, you've talked a lot about Islamophobia. You've written a book, The Enemy Within, which addresses this sort of issue. Where are things in relation to, Islamophobic attitudes towards British Muslims at the moment, would you say?
I think it gives me no comfort to say that some 7-8 years on from that speech that I gave when I said Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test, and everybody was up in arms about it because most people were protesting that it didn't exist. Well, sadly it does, and the statistics have subsequently proven that it exists. And it's not just the overt form of Islamophobia that we find on our streets which has gone up, such as attacks on women in hijabs and the awful Punish a Muslim Day letter that came out recently. But it's also the Islamophobia that we find in our editorials, in our so-called respectable newspapers, within respectable think tanks, amongst politicians, amongst academics. And so I think in many ways, and I said this recently, Islamophobia has moved beyond passing the dinner table test. It's now Britain's latest bigotry blind spot.
And what do you think is driving it? In particular, is it just where our politics is? Is it because ever since 9/11 and the demonization of Muslims or fear of Muslims has just increased? Is it an organic sort of process? What's happening with it? And why is it getting worse, do you think?
I don't think there's a single answer. Britain has always found within its borders people who it has othered. There was a time when we didn't like the Catholics very much, and we didn't like the Jews very much, and we thought women were second-class citizens, and we felt that the gay community couldn't be trusted. So we've always, sadly, throughout our history, othered people, as do most nations, and British Muslims are simply the latest in a long line of communities that we can other. Interestingly, I was at a talk recently with the last chief rabbi, the ex-chief rabbi, and he said the headlines that are being written about Muslims today could have been written about Jews 100 years ago, and indeed were. So I think, yes, of course, the war on terror and the rise in terrorist attacks is certainly a reason why people feel fearful of certain Muslim communities. But I always say go back to the evidence, and one of the things that I did in my book was really have 100 pages of citations to give evidence to what is terrorism, how big is the terrorist threat, how many people have been involved in terrorism, and according to every statistic that you can look at, less than 1/10% of British Muslims have ever been involved in any sort of terrorist-related activity. And therefore it concerns me that we talk about a community of nearly 3 million through the prism of less than 1/10% rather than through the prism of 99.9% of them.
Do you get frustrated when you just hear the label British Muslims? Because it's a huge community that is incredibly diverse ethnically, in terms of background, in terms of how long people have been here. There are British, Muslims who come from, Yemen and Pakistan and Nigeria and South Africa, and some who are, generations have been white and were Christian but have decided to sort of convert. Do you think that's a sort of a catch-all label that still frustrates you? That doesn't reflect the diversity of British Muslims?
Well, one of the things that I do in my book is have this 2 or 3 page rant about who are British Muslims, and I say that they're black, they're various shades of brown, they're your bog standard Anglo-Saxon, they shop at various supermarkets, they have various professions, they're everywhere. The way in which they view Easter, how they celebrate Christmas, how they get involved in bonfire night. So there's all these kind of different ways in which I say they're folk like you and me, and each one of them is so different because of the various backgrounds or ethnicities or culture.
And they practice Islam in very different ways.
Exactly, and so one of the things that I talk about a lot now is not just the diversity amongst British Muslim communities, but allowing British Muslim communities to write their story in their way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in my teenage years, and probably even earlier, we go back 30, 40 years now, there was was an Asian version of me, which was acceptable to the home environment. And then there was a outside the home non-Asian version of me, or there was the professional version of me and the family version of me.
You had to have lots of different identities depending on where you were.
And lots of people from ethnic minority backgrounds had those various identities, even changed their name, would have a shorter, more anglicised name when they were out and about at work or with their friends. And then I think you get to a certain age, and certainly for me, post 40, now in my late 40s, now a grandmother, I'm just grumpy and I can't be bothered to be anybody's version of me. I'm going to be my version of me, and that might be uncomfortable, and it might make some people feel like they can't quite put me within a box, but then so be it. And I really hope that we now have a generation of young British Muslims who are comfortably British, comfortably Muslim, and writing their stories in their way, as long as in their stories they have choices.
Choices in the sense that, you know, this is the kind of young British Muslim, you know, man or woman that I want to be, and people will just have to like it or leave it.
Yeah, because I don't
and it's chosen by me rather than imposed
Exactly.
by the community or by an imam or by my parents or by society or, you know, my white colleagues.
Exactly. I don't want the conservative mullah determining what kind of Muslim I have to be, and I don't want liberal intelligentsia in London telling me what kind of Muslim I want to be. I want to be able to have the choices to be the kind of Muslim I want to be, and that could be super conservative, as long as that's what I've chosen to be, or it could be super liberal. And I think we've got to stop making judgments about people and having their story and their identity fit our narrative.
Let me ask you, in terms of, British Muslim women today, if you look back at the young Sayeeda Warsi and being at university and becoming politicised and becoming a lawyer, one of the most striking statistics is the extent to which British Muslim women are in one shape or form held back. However educated they are, more of them are sort of at home or unemployed. What do you feel about that? In terms of the many different kind of constraints that hold British Muslim women back, that might be to do with society, but also might be to do within the community.
And this is why it's such a complex issue. And I think that's why I keep talking about choice. If Muslim women are choosing to stay at home because they want to be housewives or homemakers or principal carers for children and other relatives, that's fine. But if Muslim women are being held back, either by members of their family or members of the extended communities in which they live, or because of external pressures of racism and prejudice, or not being given opportunities when they're applying for jobs and Islamophobia, then those are the barriers we need to tackle. And I keep going back to this. It has to be about choice, giving the opportunities for those people who want to exercise their choice to be part of either education or the workplace. And I think it's really important for us to dig deep into this. Of course, look, I've had challenges growing up, both internal and external. There were people who felt that Muslim women shouldn't be going to university back in the 70s and 80s. I remember when my parents made a decision for us to go to university, there were members of the conservative communities around us who felt that it was inappropriate for my father to be doing this. But at the same time, I know that when I went on to qualify as a lawyer, I was told that being a lawyer was probably not the easiest place to be a working class Asian Muslim girl. And so I think people will always make judgments about you, they will limit you. But the one thing that I don't want Muslim women to be doing is self-limiting. And I do want them to believe that if they have choices, then they have to fight to be what they want to be, even if it feels that it's going to be tough.
Tell me about your experience working in government. You were very senior within the Conservative Party, you were minister with that sort of portfolio, and yet you left frustrated when you resigned. What was that experience like, and what pushed you to that point?
I think it was such a privilege to serve in the cabinet for nearly 4.5 years. I didn't think growing up in a small town in Dewsbury that girls like me would end up at the cabinet table. So it probably was one of the best jobs that I've ever done, and a real privilege to serve my country. And so and I enjoyed it. I look back on it. I always say that it's a bit like childbirth. At the time it feels really painful and you think, I'm never going to do this again. But subsequently you just remember all the good times because something good came of it.
Is it important that, there are more voices like you and more young British Muslim women who want to end up in this kind of place in politics if these kind of challenges and issues are to be answered?
I'm very honest with young British Muslim women when they come in and see me, and I mentor lots and lots of them from all aspects of politics, actually, not just from the centre-right of politics. And I say to them, look, it's tough. There was a select committee report done by my colleague Maria Miller, where she said that if you are a woman of colour and Muslim and female, then you're going to have the triple whammy. And you need to be ready for that. So I always say to them, look, it's tough. You're probably going to have to be 4 times as good to be half as much recognised and to have half as much success. But you have a choice. You can either sit back and say it's doom and I'm not going to succeed, or you can actually say this is such a great challenging time for me to go out and be the best that I possibly can.
And does it put them off politics or working in Westminster or in policy think tanks when you give them that advice?
I hope not. I hope what I do to them is give them a reality check, because politics is a tough, God-forsaken world. It is not an easy place to be. You have to have a backbone of steel. And so I think people who come into politics need to know what they're getting themselves into. Almost every day is a battle, and you will consistently be judged and criticised, and you will consistently be pushed around to become another version of yourself. And to remain true to yourself is one of the hardest things in politics, and it's what eventually in the end led me to leave cabinet, because I felt that remaining true to myself was more important than taking a seat at the cabinet table.
So are you a naturally optimistic person, given everything else you've sort of spelled out? Are you then left optimistic about the future? I mean, in terms of young British Muslims and the politics and society and challenges that they face?
I'm realistic, but there is no option but for us to remain optimistic. I think it's tough. I think in many ways there are challenges that young British Muslims are facing more acutely in a way that maybe as young British Asians we didn't. I think the form of racism that I faced as a young person was quite overt. It was the being chased after school, it was being called the P name. You knew when you were dealing with a racist, they almost, you could almost identify them from the way that they looked and the way that they dressed. I think it's much harder to identify an Islamophobe. They can come in the most respectable of settings. They can be in good suits. They can have a good Oxford education. It doesn't stop them from being a bigot. And therefore, I think young people these days may find that that kind of covert Islamophobia is much harder to deal with than the overt stuff.